Yeah, Tony Luft in this chapter, Hard Skeletons and Stained Assholes, and this was the scene you were alluding to as well, Dan. Um, it has a contrast between Walt Whitman's great poem Crossing Brooklyn Ferry and Tony Luft, and some of the lesser insights and things that he goes through are. You seem in this book particularly, it seems that Tony Luft is structured that way, where he'll be contrasted to something else. There is again a couple memories of his time at Christmas where he watches a cartoon, and then he has his memory of Buster Crab. But this seems to be the Tony Luft structure for this particular book.
Yeah.
It seems like there's different, if you were going to use music as the way to see it, there's different tones or songs for each character in each individual book. Big Frank obviously is like a large symphony in this particular book, but he's almost a minor character in others.
Well, yeah, I mean, in this particular book here, we get little scenes from Tony's life. Tony left alone on a pier, saw a gull not moving. He looked at, he was motionless. He thought of that. Yeah, that scene here, that actually happened with Jessica and I on Lake Superior, where I accidentally killed a gull that Jessica thought was was a statue or what. And I said, no, it's a real bird. And the dumbass bird didn't move, and I just rolled the pebble down, and it hit a rivet, and it hit the bird in the head, and he went into the water. And then about a minute or two later, birds started circling overhead. And I immediately thought of the bird that said, "Let's get out of here, Jess."
So talk about a little bit of the contrast between the two sections. Obviously, the great poem and then the idiot Tony Luft. And Tony Luft is so delimited in his thinking that sometimes the narrator will even reference the fact that he's a moron and will say things like thinking is hard and is particularly condescending to Luft.
Well, that was actually a statement that a friend of mine made, Jason Sanford. He one day when we were in Minneapolis, I think Jason had said something at the UPG. He said, why can't people understand something? Well, Bruce Ario may have asked that question, and Jason went, well, thinking is hard. Yeah. Well, I mean, the idea is that in the Whitman poem, of course, we're flowing on the river, and we're seeing rivers of humanity, and Whitman is ebullient in his praise of the human animal and all the magnificence of human thought and life and whatnot. And to contrast that, you have an idiot like Luft, and Luft is singular, and he goes through these very human moments in this segment, farting and shitting and accidentally killing something and being just a general dumbass, climbing up a pole, and then the street sign snaps off under his weight and he limps away. Little moments of humiliation. And so it's the chorus anti-chorus of this grand elevation of Whitman, which in many ways there's truth to that. There is grandeur in the human animal, but by the same token, you have the Tony Lufts, this lonely individual who has never fit in. Throughout his life never fit in. Tony Luft, probably never had any real love affair. He probably just had sex with prostitutes. His striking out with Carla Maravelli when he tries to pick her up after she tries to hire him to kill Paulie is a good example of his total ineptitude around females. And that's just as real too. This lonely, violent, dark little man. So you get the yin and yang of the Whitmanian vision and the Luftian reality within this book. And it ends again, I think, with another one of the Buster Crab moments here, and
Yeah, it does. Before that, though, he has an interaction with the priest where, you go through a very high and low in your senses. So it will go. Luft was in the confessional booth. Father Jared again was asking him to confess his sins. Luft thought, I'm a Jew. He did not say it, but he thought it. Of course, his mother, being a Roman Catholic, made sure that he was a Jew in ethnicity only, save for the fact that his father insisted on his being circumcised. The priest pressed him for information he knew about Luft. He knew Luft was a killer. He knew Luft was a paid assassin. He knew Luft had killed 2 members of his own flock. He pressed. Luft judged and thought he was odd that he was understood me. The priest pressed. Luft squirmed. Then he farted. Who was he? The booth was silent, but there was more than 2 men in it. And that's a great line to end this section, because you kind of pause on that line and think of maybe some of the philosophic moments with it, even though it literally goes from, this interaction with the priest to letting loose a fart.
Yeah, and I talked about, when you talk about, I've got, in this book, I've got dozens of great scenes like that Big Frank Sneaker scene that I would put, if you took the top 100 scenes in prose fiction, I could argue there's probably 2 or 3 dozen of them right from this book. And I could argue that I'll put, I could fill out the top 100. If you took the top 100 scenes in my all of my fiction, it would probably be equal to or greater than the top 100 scenes written by all other published writers combined. But by the same token, that scene you just described, and I just looked at it before, it's a perfect little filmic moment there. 2 men, they know each other. They're both hypocrites, because this priest is a hypocrite for shriving a guy who knows a scumbag like Luft, and he farts. And what's in between it? Is it just the 2 men and the smell? Is it the 2 men and the hypocrisy? Is it all of that? And those are those kinds of moments that someone like a Jonathan Franzen, who's nothing but a soap opera writer, or Richard Russo, that someone like a Terry McMillan or Toni Morrison, who are soap opera writers, the postmodern crap of the Pynchons and the what's his name, Wallace's, they can't write. But someone like me, who's a great poet, and who I can see those things. These are the kinds of things that a lot of prose writers, even great prose writers, sometimes miss. But you'll find a lot of these little poetic moments. And we talked before about how Jessica is more obviously poetic, but a moment like that about Luft and his priest, even though it's a funny moment too, is every bit as poetic as Jessica's more traditionally poetic prose.
Yes, I would agree, and it's a little tiny moment in a huge gargantuan book. But I wanted to ask you, you mentioned some obviously bad to mediocre writers, if I am going to grant them mediocrity, but how can you think of any writer who succeeds at the big moments but doesn't really get the tiny moments interspersed in their work? So say that they can write a great scene, but they don't know how to structure the book properly so that there's tiny moments giving hints to character. One of the names I would think of would be James Joyce. I think that he has some great scenes, but he is unable to structure a novel very properly.
Well, yeah, and I've said that many times before, that Joyce, you could argue, is a great writer, but he's not in any way, shape, or form a great novelist. And you can see that in his 4 or 5 best short stories from Dubliners. His best work is The Dead, that long short story / short novella. Most of the writers who have greatness in the last 50 years, someone like a Charles Johnson or someone like a William Kennedy, are capable of having the little moments, but they don't have, their books overall don't have the overall heft. When I think of something like Ironweed or Legs, some of the early great books by Kennedy, they have, there's maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 moments in each of those books that are sort of like those Luft moments, but they don't have it takes a mindset. You have to, we've talked before about the difference between being a visionary, creationary, and functionary mindset. Most of the prose writers that write, and most artists, are incapable of being visionaries. A visionary isn't someone who just has an idea. Oh, I have this futuristic idea of a metropolis-like society, like Fritz Lang's movie. A vision is being able to immerse someone in your work so that it feels like your idea of reality is reality. That's difficult to do. In
Do you think vision only extends to the arts, or that it can? This is a question I have my own response, but do you think it only extends to the arts, or it can play in other pursuits as well?
Well, people have asked that, like, was Einstein a visionary? I don't know. I think vision, just as creativity flowers out of the functionary life, so does vision out of a creationary life. Scientists are not by nature creative individuals. They have little moments of creativity in service to discovery, but they are discovering piecemeal what reality is. Um, Isaac Asimov, for example, his Foundation trilogy, that world, that galaxy, that reality that he created there, while it's certainly not as complex as later works, uh, that came in science fiction in a certain sense, uh, he established something. The whole, you wouldn't have Star Wars without the Foundation trilogy. Not that I think Star Wars is all that great of shakes, but uh, there's certainly a vision there. The whole idea of psychohistory, of looking back on in from a greater time in the future at what is the past to that character, but is our future still, is a leap of logic that works. It's a conceit that works in that work. To say that, for example, Darwin was a visionary, no, Darwin worked very piecemeal. That's to misunderstand what the term vision really is. Um, that the Oppenheimer or those who worked on that atomic bomb, that they were visionaries. I mean, I'm loath to say that scientists can be visionaries. I think you can be a philosopher and have a vision. I think you can be certainly an artist as a visionary, but I'm not sure it extends to science. I could be wrong, but I don't think so.
And I think that idea of yours has kind of mutated throughout the times, because I've recalled you've stating that vision is seen further than the creationary, and
Yeah.
that would extend to Darwin and a few others. But obviously, with
Well, but I've
this
I've
definition that you're
always
coming
said,
up with now, it doesn't exactly pertain to him, because he's not immersing you in a world. He's more or less just taking the world and summing it up in some sense.
yeah. Well, but I've always maintained that a vision is to have a worldview that change. I mean, I guess maybe you could say in that sense Darwin and evolution, but again, it wasn't just Darwin alone. There was Wallace and a few other
It was
people.
Wallace.
But the idea of evolution, you could say, was visionary. So I'll grant you Darwin more so than an Einstein. Uh, you know, you could say, for example, but even so, the reason that I'm more loath to say Darwin was a visionary than, say, you could argue Melville is because other people could have done what Darwin did, and other people did do what Darwin did. Melville, good or bad, stands alone as the ultimate Melville. Darwin is, you could argue, maybe a hyper Wallace, or Wallace was an infra Darwin. They were on the same track, but Darwin understood a little bit more deeply than Wallace, and was a little bit more persistent, and was a little bit more tenacious, and that's why we know Darwin 90%. When people think of discoverers of evolution, 90% will think just Darwin alone. 10% of people will say, "Oh yeah, and Wallace too."
Not to mention the hundreds of years of hints that led those two men to eventually gather the idea. Wallace isn't given enough credit in most circles. They always ascribe Darwin, but Wallace came up with the idea. Darwin was able to actually give it a name and discern exactly the inner workings of it.
Well, also Wallace later in his life became more religious, and he veered away from hard science. He became more invested, I think, in spiritualism. So his later uh, personal demons or lunacy hurt him.
I think that's just a case of taking an opinion and just ascribing it to the gods or whatnot, instead of thinking independently for yourself when they don't give enough credit to Wallace and give it all to Darwin. They have for decades now.